Hi, it's Kirsty. Today I wanted to cover a couple of topics in this video. The first being the difference between OCD cure and OCD recovery. The second being about the language that we use around OCD and OCD topics and how it can affect our levels of anxiety and suffering. So firstly, sometimes when we realise that we're suffering from OCD, we go around looking for a cure for OCD. And it can be quite disheartening when you realise, when you start reading about it, that there actually isn't a cure for it. There's recovery and there's treatment, but there's not an out-and-out cure. So a cure would be to get rid of it completely. To cure yourself of an ailment would mean that you take it away, which, as far as we know, as far as I know, there is not one for OCD. There is treatment to bring you to a recovered state so that OCD no longer affects your everyday life and you don't realise that you have it. But of course, with recovery from OCD, that would still require maintenance. Whereas if you were cured of something, you wouldn't necessarily have to continue to maintain that state of being cured because it's gone. Whereas with OCD, we are supposedly, well, there's lots of different theories about OCD, whether it's a biological thing that we are born with, whether it's been developed over time, and there's a school of thought that it's a combination of the two, that we're born with it and it can be brought out because of various things that have happened in our life and our personality types and beliefs, etc. Nobody has the certain answer there, but generally it's considered to be perhaps a combination of biological and external factors. But either way, as far as we know, there's not necessarily a cure, so we work towards recovery, meaning that we aim to be at a point where OCD no longer affects our life and we don't realise that necessarily, well, we don't notice that we have it. But with that, it's also important to maintain your recovery by still practicing working on beliefs and not becoming too complacent. So the second topic that I wanted to cover was language in relation to how we speak in our minds and how we speak out loud. One of the books on the OCD recovery reading list is the Albert Ellis book titled How to Stubbornly Refuse to Make Yourself Miserable About Anything, ... Yes, anything. So in this book, Albert Ellis talks about unconditional life, self and other acceptance, but as well as that, he talks about how we bring about our own disturbed feelings by the way we talk about events that are happening. So we might witness an event or a situation, and then there's a moment, and then there's our reaction to it. And in our reaction, quite often it's the language that we may use that makes it feel all the more that makes it bring out all the more suffering. An example of this type of language would be the word awful. So in this book, Albert Ellis refers to the term awfulizing. I think that may actually be an Albert Ellis-ism rather than a book that's rather than a word that's in the English dictionary. But yes, awfulizing. So here, it's basically in your mind, it's the language would be, oh my God, this is so awful. It's so terrible. I absolutely can't stand it. I can't bear it. Oh, get it away. It's awful, whatever the situation may be. So if we think about the word awful to describe something like, for example, my OCD has been so bad today, it's awful. That is insinuating that it's as bad as it could possibly be. And it's those types of words that can bring about suffering in anxiety and even depressive feelings. So what could help is if we redefine the word awful or the word terrible. So looking at those words as being the absolute worst that a situation could possibly be, which could mean torture, eternal pain and torturing forever and ever and ever. If you redefine those words as being that's the most awful and terrible thing, then you can start to think about other language that you may use to describe how your OCD or your anxiety feels, or how it would feel if your theme was actually real. For example, instead of thinking it would be absolutely awful if I was to harm a loved one, you would think, okay, so absolutely awful is eternal pain, suffering and torture. So it would be really, really bad if I was to harm a loved one, but it wouldn't be awful because that is the absolute worst thing ever. And this actually isn't. It's bad. It's really, really bad. You still don't want to do it, but it's not the worst thing ever. Another word that we might find ourselves using in our minds is, or another phrase is, I can't stand it. So I can't stand how this anxiety feels. I'm so low, I can't stand it. And in that same, under that same umbrella of language, I can't bear it. Oh my God, I absolutely can't bear it. I can't tolerate it. It's intolerable. If something is truly intolerable, again, it's as bad as it could possibly be, and the world would swallow you up, and it would be eternal damnation and suffering and everything bad. But actually, if you think about it, you've described things as being intolerable previously, yet you've made it through that day. Therefore, technically, it's not intolerable. As the same goes to say for if you've said previously, I can't stand that feeling, or I couldn't stand it if insert theme being real. Well, actually, you've lived many days in uncertainty about your theme being real, and you have stood it. You've gone to bed, you've woken up, you've risen the next day, you've gone to work, you've done various things. You have more than stood it, in fact. You've more than bared it, you've more than tolerated it. You've lived with that. Therefore, that completely disproves the fact that you say you can't stand it, you can't bear it, you can't tolerate it. Once you can identify the language that you might be using in your mind, or the language that might be used to define your beliefs, that can help you dispute the irrationality of it. So, for example, if one was suffering with relationship OCD, they might have in their mind said, it would be awful if I didn't love my partner. I couldn't stand it. Then you could perhaps write down that exact phrase or belief. You don't have to identify it in those exact words, but generally it will be kind of around, it would be along those lines. You can start saying, well, actually, I have stood it. I have stood those feelings, and I have tolerated the uncertainty of that being true, because every day for the last week I've woken up next to my partner. I haven't left, and the world hasn't swallowed me up. Therefore, I have stood it, and it hasn't been awful. It's been hard experiencing these thoughts and feelings when I don't want to necessarily be experiencing them, and still staying in this situation. It's been very hard, but awful? No. Terrible? No. Have you stood it? Yes, you've tolerated it. So if we link these kinds of extreme words and phrases to unconditional acceptance, essentially, if we believe something is terrible and awful, we're saying we don't accept it. We don't accept the situation or ourselves if it's true or something. And if we say we can't stand it, tolerate it, bear it, we're saying we can't accept it. But if we can start to put these things on a scale, with those descriptions being the absolute most extreme, the worst it could possibly be, then you can start moving your feared scenario down the scale. When you start thinking, how could it be worse? How could it be worse? How could it be worse? And it's those extreme, it's as bad as it could possibly be, that fuels the absolute fear and terror behind that scenario. So when you can take away some of that fear and terror, that's when you can work on accepting it, and that's when you can start bringing down your, as Albert Ellis would describe it, disturbed feelings, meaning the feelings that we may consider to be affecting our mental health, and depression, anxiety, etc. So that's how that can help. But there are other words that bring about suffering as well. For example, the word should. I should be like this, I should be doing this, so-and-so should say this, I should be able to do this. This is something, so Albert Ellis refers to this as shoulding all over yourself. And you can dispute the rationality of the word should by saying, well, if should was the case and it was an absolute rule, then I would feel the right way, or I wouldn't feel this way. I wouldn't be having these symptoms, these feelings that I don't want to have. If should really was a thing, then I couldn't possibly be feeling it. However, because should is something that society has made up over time, it's actually irrational. And once you start to look at this, you can start to take away these rules and stop shoulding all over yourself. And it's the same as using the word too to describe something being too difficult. It's too bad. I can't do it. It's too difficult. If something was technically too difficult, nobody would have done it before. That kind of coincides with having a kind of a fixed mindset, whereas if you can change that to be more of a growth mindset, when you believe that you can work on things and things can change, then you can start to use the word to a little bit less when you're describing how difficult something is. If you have the belief, I can't recover, it's too difficult, then you think, well, if it was too difficult, nobody would reach the recovery point. And people do, because there are people like Rob, for example, who coaches people through their OCD recovery journey. He proves that it's not too difficult. It is difficult, yes, bloody difficult, but it's not too difficult. But I hope that talking through some of this language can help you maybe identify some of the language that you're using in your mind to that almost fuels extra fear and anxiety. And I hope it can be useful to you when you're disputing the rationality of some of your beliefs. Thank you for watching.